This is Mr. Barlow, and welcome to another instalment of Tudor History. Today's purple learning question is, what were the English Civil War armies like? Now, last lesson we discussed the causes of the English Civil War, and by the end of the lesson, we were poised at the point where Charles raises the royal banner at Oxford to recruit an army, and Parliament does likewise in London. Exciting stuff. Now, we see here pictured on his horse the daddy of modern warfare who helped Sweden punch above its weight to become a major power of the Enlightenment period. Now, his changes to warfare by getting different types of soldiers to fight together and protect each other influenced both the Royalist and the Parliament's armies. Now, spot the difference between the two sets of soldiers. What do you see? Well, that's a cruel question because there's actually no difference. You can't tell the difference between the Royalist and Parliament's armies because they both wore the same things. They were absolutely identical. They all wore red, blue, green, yellow, white coats. The stereotype for Parliament's army was that they cut their hair short, earning the nickname Roundheads, and wore very plain and simple clothes. And the Royalists had long hair, colourful clothes, and rode beautiful horses. From the cavalier came from the word calaberos, a Spanish word meaning horseman. Yes, there may have been more of such types on one side, yet half the rich nobles fought on Parliament's side, and many poor people fought for the king. The looks of the army were interchangeable, so you could have a hippie hair, wearing silk breeches, and still fight for Parliament. Now, it wasn't until 1645, the end of the Civil War, that Parliament formed a red uniformed army called the New Model Army, and that our armies looked different. Now, today, what are our learning intentions? First of all, let's define the keywords to do with fighting in the English Civil War. I can explain the advantages and disadvantages of the different types of soldiers, and finally I can analyse which type of soldier was the most important to winning battles. Please now complete the heads and tails activity for the keywords of today by linking the keyword to its correct definition using an arrow. Turn me off for a couple of minutes. Hopefully your arrows look something like this. Amateurs means unpaid, New Model Army, professionally trained soldiers in red uniforms. Tactics is moving soldiers on the battlefield. A sash was a ribbon worn over the shoulder to identify the different armies. Ironsides was a nickname for Oliver Cromwell's heavily armoured cavalry, and a melee, which is a French word, means a small battle. Now, in 1642, when the English Civil War started, both sides thought their army should be amateur, fighting for their beliefs rather than coin. However, in 1645, Parliament's New Model Army changed opinion when its professional, meaning paid army, which was led by talented officers and in red uniforms, became the British colour of choice until the First World War became an unstoppable force. Now, both Royalist and Parliament sides use very, very similar weapons and tactics. Now, the weapons which were used were namely firearms called muskets. They used pistols, pikes, which were huge, like 6-meter spears, swords, and rudimentary cannons. So very, very simple cannons. They still wore armour, and some, like the cuirassiers of Parliament's Earl of Essex's lifeguards, his personal bodyguard, they looked like medieval knights in head-to-toe armour. When the armies lined up for battle, the infantry containing pikemen and musketeers would be in the centre, with the cavalry on the wings. that's the sides. The few cannons which were around during the English Civil War were mixed into the centre. Now, task 3. From the soldiers illustrated left, indicate which soldier is from the English Civil War. Hopefully, you will have picked out the one below the 1600s with these lobster pot helmet, breastplate and tassets, which were guards for the thighs. Now, have a go at task 4. Use the illustration left to describe in a paragraph how armour has changed over time. Turn me off for 5 minutes. How do you decide friend from foe, meaning enemy, where there are no uniforms? Well, they wore different coloured sashes, although there were occasions when they both rocked up to the battle wearing the same colour. Sometimes they wore white paper in hats, and there's a famous example of Lord Fairfax, who was the Parliament's commander at the Battle of Marston Moor. He got separated from his own troops. He was mixing in with the Royalists. He simply just took the white paper out of his hat and made his way back to his own lines. Other ways they distinguished friend from foe was by passwords as well. So again, something that if you knew the password has been shouted out enough during the battle, then you might be able to disguise yourself as, or pass yourself off as a royalist or parliamentarian. Now, there must have been lots of mistakes, which is called friendly fire, when you'd be cut down by your own side. Imagine the confusion of the battle. You're high on adrenaline. You're shouting. There's a clash of swords, smoke from muskets and cannons all around you, and you only have a split second to separate a St. Leonard's boy from a Hastings boy. Now, the elite of the armies fought on horseback as cavalry. They could move around the battlefield quickly and many times swept the battlefield. Cavalry didn't like getting in front of pikemen. Obviously, horses don't like spiky things, but they could attack to the sides and rear of the pikemen, and the cavalry carried pistols as well as swords. The Royalists had the best cavalry in the early part of the war, led by the dashing Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who taught his cavalry to fire their pistols just before charging into the enemy. However, Parliament eventually had more disciplined cavalry called Ironsides, led by Oliver Cromwell, who could charge and reform and charge again, whilst the undisciplined royalist cavalry were often occupied plundering the enemy baggage train of its wine rather than coming back to the battlefield. Pikemen were infantry with long spears of about 5 or 6 meters, called pikes. They're very, very heavy. The push of pike often carried the day, where these prickly hedgehogs of opposing pikemen fought in giant rugby scrums, pushing, wrestling, and trampling each other off the battlefield. Pikes were great for warding off cavalry, but if the pikemen were caught to their vulnerable sides or rear, they would be slaughtered. Musketeers fired an early rifle called a musket, where you would light a fuse to make the weapon fire a small ball. Stop me for a minute or so to click onto the hyperlink to see a musket being loaded and fired. The musketeers used a rest because the musket was so heavy. Even the best musketeers could only fire once per minute. They were sort of accurate over 50 meters, but could kill 350 meters away. Often the only person they injured, though, was themselves, with gunpowder flashes from the musket, and if your powder was wet, you could forget firing for that day. Task 6. Study the illustration. What does it tell you about musketeers? And do you think that as the illustration was made at the time, is it more or less accurate? Turn me off for about 3 minutes. Dragoons were a mixture of horse and foot soldiers. They arrived on the battlefield on cheap horses, but then dismounted and hid in bushes and trees, usually along the flanks, that's the sides of the enemy. They were useful for reconnaissance, that's spying, holding outposts like bridges and crossroads, and making ambushes. Field artillery. Cannons were used in the English Civil War battlefields, firing a ball once every 3 minutes. They could also fire grape shot, that's lots of small balls and other sharp objects to be fired at close range. Cannons move about making, more about making big noises, smoke, and creating fear, rather than actually causing casualties on the battlefield at this point. The mortars were pretty destructive, and you would like to click onto the hyperlink. We have Roaring Meg versus the Caravan. Who wins? Now, siege artillery were huge cannons which needed a team of 16 horses to move around. They were very destructive to medieval stone castles and could end up in long sieges in days when brought up to the walls. Kenilworth and Scarborough Castles and Bristol are good examples of where Parliament siege cannons blasted holes in the fortifications which were taken by storm or attack afterwards. Now task 5. Choose a type of soldier and sketch him. Then annotate, that meaning label, 3 or more of its characteristics. Turn me off for 10 minutes. Task 6. List into the table below the types of soldiers in the Civil War with their advantages and disadvantages. Allow 10 minutes for this activity. Task 7. Which type of soldier do you think would have been the most effective on the battlefield? Meaning, which would have fought the best? Explain why. And task 8. Which type of soldier would you have preferred to have been if you'd been in the Civil War? I personally like the idea of hiding with the dragoons in the trees or under a bush for the battle, but St. boys and girls are much tougher than me. Allow 5 minutes to answer these 2 questions. Finally, as a learning review, spend 5 minutes answering task 9 and 10. Identify one thing you feel you've learnt well and one thing you could have done better or developed more. Thank you for listening.